Good afternoon, everybody. I'm so glad you're here. Welcome to our social justice teams program this afternoon with Glenn Kirschner. He is a retired attorney, former JAG officer with the U.S. Attorney's Office in District of Columbia for 24 years. He was just telling me about all the cases that he did, and he was in charge of the homicide division, and so he did some major work. What he's doing now is probably one of the most important things. He's now retired from all that. He's on his own. He's no longer with MSNBC. He's working on Substack with his podcast, his YouTube program on Justice Matters, talking about the rule of law, the Constitution, and why that's so important all the time, but especially now with what we're going through. And we have a copy of the Constitution for everybody. So if you did not get one when you came in, please raise your hand. Sherry will get one to you, okay? And we'll bring one to you. And Glennis, he has some prepared comments, and then at the end, he'll take questions. So stay around, bring your questions, think about your questions. So Glenn Kirschner, we're so happy to have you here with us today. Thank you, thanks. Sure.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. First of all, thank you to Reverend Russ. Thank you to Patty. Thank you to Francis, who I know heard her back this morning. We've been emailing, so and I guess I can walk around because I'm mic'd up now, right? I spent 30 years walking around in the courtrooms talking to my jury, so that's kind of my comfort spot. So thank you for the invite. I still kind of pinch myself because after 30 years and 6 months as a Fed, 30 years as a federal prosecutor, I wasn't allowed to speak publicly about what I did, my work, when I was investigating in the grand jury, what I was trying in the courts of, well, first the military and then Washington, D.C., both local court and federal court. I wasn't allowed to talk about work because federal prosecutors really don't talk about what they do in court, with one exception. At the end of the case, if the U.S. attorney, I worked for the D.C. U.S. Attorney's Office, and the PAO, the public affairs officer, said, Glenn, go on the courthouse steps, thank the jury for their hard work, thank the officers, agents, detectives, thank the family and the witnesses and the victim, if the victim was surviving. I did homicide cases for 22 of my 30 years. So the victims were the family members of somebody who had been taken by violent crime, were the community that lost a valued community member. But that was the only time I was allowed to talk publicly. And then after serving continuously as a Fed under every president from Ronald Reagan through Donald Trump in his first term, my wife and I sat down and talked about, well, should I continue to be a Fed for another 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 years? I love what I've been doing for the last 30 plus years. Or should I try something new? And we decided together that I would take my retirement, so to speak, and try something new. And then I got to start talking publicly about things inside the Department of Justice. One of them, I know how DOJ operates. I was really fortunate to get to learn about the rule of law and the Constitution through the work I got to do as a prosecutor. And one thing I do in my talk with any audience is I thank you for paying my salary as a Fed, as a public servant. I got to mass whatever information, knowledge, and experience I have about the rule of law and the Constitution and the criminal justice system because you all paid my salary. And I took that very, very seriously. I always wanted to make sure that I gave the taxpayers their dollars worth. So let me just tell you a little bit about my background, and we're going to launch into where we stand presently on the rule of law front and on the constitutional front and the challenges that we're obviously contending with. And, everything's not coming up roses right now. That's pretty clear. but we tend to focus on the abuses of the rule of law and the constitutional rights of everybody. And they're there, and we're going to talk about them today. But you know, there are lots of points of light that are trying to pierce through what I call, and I'm not a political guy, I'm not a political expert, I'm not a political pundit, I never played one on TV, I'm a rule of law guy, but I call it the Trump-induced darkness. And there are points of light that are piercing through that darkness, and there are silver linings behind the big dark cloud, you know, on the rule of law front right now. So real quick, I was born in Brooklyn, grew up in Jersey. My pop was a high school football coach, coached all over New Jersey, and a wrestling coach, hard living guy, as we say. My mom was a wonderful, fiery little Irish woman who never went to college, but was smarter than all of us put together. And I consider that I had a really balanced upbringing because I learned all the do's from my mom and all the don'ts from my dad. So all in all, I think it all kind of evened itself out. I was always interested in two things: military service and law enforcement, but I knew I didn't want to be a police officer. I had no interest in wearing a badge on my chest and a gun on my hip and ordering people out of their cars or protecting the community, which is a big part of what the police do, protect and serve. But I had an interest in law enforcement, and I always knew I wanted to serve in the Army, as did my pop before me. So I took an ROTC scholarship at Washington and Lee University down in Lexington, Virginia. And I was branched military intelligence, but decided I would take an educational deferment of my active duty responsibilities, 4 years, and put myself through law school up in Boston and enter back in the 80s as an Army JAG. And had the really good fortune to be an Army JAG prosecutor for about 6.5 years, first in the trial court, handling court-martial cases because soldiers tend to get themselves in trouble, and then in the appeals courts. And there are 2 levels of appeals courts in the military, and there's a direct line of appeal to the United States Supreme Court. So we actually got to write briefs in opposition to what are called petitions for writs of cert review in the Supreme Court. So I handled death penalty cases, an espionage case out of Desert Storm, got some great experience, both trial and appellate experience as an Army JAG. And then for my second Army tour, the Army brought me to Northern Virginia. That was in 1991, and I've never left. And I consider this home for a couple of reasons. First, we raised 5 daughters in Fairfax County. And so I am very fond of Fairfax County and the public schools here. We found the house that was on the market closest to the schools we wanted to send our daughters to, which Canterbury Woods Elementary, Frost Middle School, and Woodson High School. And they got to walk to elementary school, and the other 2 schools weren't far from us. So, you know, I'm kind of a Fairfax County guy, even though I live out in Loudoun County now. And because in the Army, they tend to sort of promote you out of the courtroom at about the 6 or 7 year mark on active duty, I had decided that I was never going to leave the courtroom. So instead, I left the Army and I joined the United States Attorney's Office for the District of Columbia, part of the Department of Justice. That's the field office for the Department of Justice. And we did all of the prosecutions in DC, both local and federal, which is unlike the other 93 United States Attorney's offices around the country and in the territories. They have federal prosecutions, which in the grand scheme of things makes up about 1% of the criminal cases in the United States, because it's the state, county, and local prosecutors that handle the overwhelming majority of the prosecutions, the criminal prosecutions, except in DC, where we were both the federal prosecutors and the local prosecutors. We were like district attorneys for the District of Columbia because it wasn't a state and they didn't have a district attorney's office. So we did it all, one-stop shopping for prosecutions. I ultimately worked for Bob Mueller as my chief of homicide for a number of years. When Bob left, I became chief of homicide. So for years, responsible for overseeing all grand jury investigations and all murder prosecutions in the courts of Washington, D.C. And that was a very robust practice, very challenging practice, a very weighty practice. And as I say, I was a prosecutor for 30 years, then decided to retire. And the day after I retired, MSNBC put me on a train from Union Station up to 30 Rockefeller Center, put me on air 9 times in 3 days. I didn't know if I could talk on TV. No idea. But apparently they thought I did okay. They put me under contract, and I was an on-air legal analyst for 6.5 years with MSNBC until about a year ago when I asked if they would release me from my contract because I no longer wanted to be part of corporate media. I wanted to be completely independent, which is what I am now as a legal analyst. So a lot of us have gravitated away from corporate media. Jim Acosta, Don Lemon, Joy Reid, and others, and we're now all over on Substack. I'm not plugging my Substack, but we're all over there, and we're doing independent journalism and reporting and legal analysis with no corporate money, with no editors telling us what to say or what to steer clear of. I did get a little bit of that when I was part of corporate media, and I didn't take too kindly to it. So now I'm all independent. So I have a YouTube channel, Justice Matters, where I do a daily video on what's going on the rule of law front that day. And then every night at about 8:30 p.m., we're over on Substack Live with what we call our community meetings. Francis was at our community meeting, as was maybe Peggy, somebody else was at our community meeting. And we talk about the legal issue of the day over on Substack. And for what it's worth, everything I do online is free. I don't like paywalls, and I don't like when you have to click to get content and all that. So it's all free, both on YouTube and on Substack. All right, enough about me, way too much about me. The rule of law front. I think the place to start is probably the first day of Donald Trump's second term, because that's when the lawlessness and the unconstitutionality began. I don't say any of this from a place of politics. You know, on air, as a legal analyst, I talked quite a bit about the criminal prosecution of Senator Bob Menendez, a Democrat who engaged in horrible public corruption crimes. I talked about that a lot because he needed to be held accountable. I talked about the crimes of Hunter Biden. He committed crimes. He's obviously a Democrat, as is his father. But he committed crimes. I tend to think he was selectively prosecuted, and we could do an hour on why I tend to believe that. That doesn't mean he didn't commit those crimes. He did, given the evidence that has been reported. I talked about the criminal indictment of Henry Cuellar, a Democrat, member of Congress out in Texas. And nobody called me names when I talked about the crimes that the Democrats were committing. But then when I say, let's turn to the crimes Donald Trump has committed, they start calling me names. Oh, you're a libtard, and you must die. I mean, the death threats come early and often, pipe bomb threats come. I don't say that for any reason other than to highlight where we are in our public discourse right now. So I always want to give that qualifier up front because I don't come at any of this from a place of politics. But one party, particularly in our executive branch and in Congress, really excel at violating the law and the Constitution these days. So that's what we have to talk about, and that's what we have to fight against and prepare for the accountability mission that is coming. And I'll talk about that toward the end of my comments. So if we start on the first day of Donald Trump's term, second term, one of the very first acts as president was for him to pick up that black Sharpie that he is so enamored of. Somebody slid a copy of the Constitution under his nose, a document I'm still convinced he's probably never read. I don't say that as a punchline. And he tried to cross out the guarantee of birthright citizenship. He thought he had that power to amend the Constitution as he pleased. 3 days later, January 23rd, a Ronald Reagan appointed federal judge who had been on the bench for more than 40 years named John Coffenauer said, and I quote, what Donald Trump did trying to cross out the constitutional guarantee of birthright citizenship is, quote, blatantly unconstitutional. A Republican appointed president who instantly was attacked by Donald Trump as being a lunatic left-wing radical. Not true, obviously. And ever since that day, day one, there has been this unabated string of crimes and unconstitutional acts coming out of the Oval Office. Unconstitutional executive order, one after another after another. And we have judges from coast to coast appointed by presidents who are Democrats, presidents who are Republicans, who have been ruling against Donald Trump. We'll get to the Supreme Court in a few minutes. And that is one of the points of flight, is the federal judiciary is holding strong. My goodness, are they holding strong? And I have a few examples of that as we kind of move through the comments this morning. So I'd like to start with the attempted unconstitutional revocation of the guarantee of birthright citizenship. And then I like to end on it for a completely different reason that I think gives me reason to be both comforted and optimistic about where we're headed and how we're going to get there. So we have seen the rule of law under attack when law firms are extorted, right? Because the president doesn't like a client or a cause a particular law firm takes up. He's going to issue executive orders punishing them for deigning to represent clients he doesn't like. Not only that, the executive orders actually prohibited lawyers from those firms to walk into federal buildings like courthouses. Again, it's hard to envision something that is more just laughably unconstitutional, you know, in violation of their First Amendment speech rights, their assembly rights, the Sixth Amendment right to zealous representation of counsel. That's just for openers. And the good news is the four law firms that instantly went to court just crushed that that executive order, crushed it easily. You know, the judges virtually laughed at it. But there were a series of law firms that decided not to stand for principle and decided that it was in their financial interest to go into the Oval Office, give the bully their lunch money without a fight or a challenge, thinking that the bully was now going to leave them alone. That's not the way bullies operate. Take it from me. I grew up in Jersey, which is what makes it really hard for me not to cuss sometimes. But that's not the way bullies operate. And what did we see happen to some of those law firms? One of them had McDonald's as a client. That's a big corporate client, McDonald's. And McDonald's ended up saying, if they can't fight for their rights, this law firm that I'm paying millions and millions, and well, then they're not going to be able to fight for my rights. And they walked away from some of those law firms. And McDonald's is just one example. As I've said in the past, I decided to stand in solidarity with McDonald's by instantly running out and getting a big chocolate shake. That's how I support their decision. And I like chocolate shakes. So then you have universities. He's lashing out against universities. Some are standing strong like Harvard, and some are bending a knee like Columbia. And I have friends who went to Columbia. I'm not here to call Columbia University, but they bent the knee instantly. And that endangers us all. It endangers the academic independence of every other college and university in the country when a Columbia bends the knee. And here's what I love. This was some months ago, but y'all probably remember it because it's in our backyard here. One of my daughters, well, 5 daughters. I had daughters who went to virtually every college in the country, I feel like. One of my daughters went to George Mason. President Trump actually demanded an apology from the president of George Mason, Gregory Washington, for his support of DEI policies. Remember this? And you know what President Washington, see, this gives me justice goosebumps. You know what he said? Very pointed answer. No. That's what we need. That's what we need. Because bullies don't take kindly to people standing up to them. And that's how you defeat a bully, ultimately. But he's still going after universities, and many of them are still standing strong. He went after news organizations. And he's got some under his thumb, like CBS. But the one that I always hold up as, and a lot of news organizations are fighting him, and they're going to win in the long term. The one I always hold up as an example is, aspiring dictators. That's not me calling him names. He said, I will be a dictator on day one. His word, and just like he said, we are at war. He used the word war right now. And I'm not a fan of war. My worldview is we all do better when we all do better. And my wife grew up in Iran during the revolution and had her rights taken away from her and had boys pointing guns at her head and her mother's head saying, cover up more of your hair, or we will kill you. And they had to get out in 1982. And so she's here saying, oh, I've seen this movie before. I lived this experience before. She said long before I ever even thought of it, watch how they revoke women's constitutional privacy rights to make their own reproductive health decisions. And I said, no, Roe v. Wade. She said, no, watch. She sees around corners that I can never see around. She's had experiences that I never had. And so the reason I say he's an aspiring dictator is because he said, I will be a dictator on day one. And then I always like to have the rest of his quote. He said, but only on day one. Because as we all know, when dictators come into absolute power on day one, they always relinquish it voluntarily on day two. That's what dictators do. No, and he has been acting as an aspiring dictator ever since day one. And one thing dictators hate is when you make fun of them. Police hate when you stand up to them. Dictators hate when you make fun of them and you joke about them because it diminishes them and it raises the rest of us up to be a little bit more brave. And what Donald Trump really wanted was Jimmy Kimmel to be the air permanently. And what did he accomplish? He was back on air in a week. He's not a very good dictator if he couldn't keep a comedian off air for 1 week because there were other forces, including money, that were more important to people than what Donald Trump wanted or didn't want. That diminishes him. He's launched a direct attack on federal government employees. And as Russell Vogt said, was caught on a hot mic or an undercover recording saying, we're going to put the federal employees in trauma. And they did, and they are. The people that I served with at the U.S. Attorney's Office, that was my professional home, and that is my professional family. And even after I left as a legal analyst for MSNBC, I was back in court, my old stomping grounds, every day covering the trials for MSNBC, the Oath Keepers, the Proud Boys, Roger Stone, Steve Bannon, all those criminal trials. And it was my former, many of them homicide prosecutors, my dear friends, my trial partners. I tried cases with those prosecutors who ended up doing heroic work, holding the January 6th attackers accountable for their crimes. We saw the crimes with our own eyes. And what Trump and his DOJ leadership, air quotes, did when he retook power was either fired or demoted them all. The people who had been doing the hard work of holding those folk accountable for attacking the Capitol, in a very real sense, attacking our democracy. And they either wrongfully terminated them, many of them are suing, and they're going to win. Of course, the suit is being defended with our tax dollars. They're going to win. And the ones he didn't fire, he demoted. He took, I won't name names, but some of the best homicide prosecutors, national security prosecutors, and public corruption prosecutors, not just in Washington, D.C., but in the nation, and demoted them down to misdemeanors, put them in the basement so they could screen shoplifting cases. Not only is that a horrific disservice to these career public servants, but it's a danger to the community, to the people of DC and the people of the nation, because their skills and their experience and their wisdom has now been stripped away from the people. So yes, they are putting federal workers in trauma. They are using prosecutorial power in ways that I thought unimaginable. But there's a point of light hidden amidst this darkness, because when I see them going into grand jury after grand jury after grand jury, and those are my grand jury rooms. No, I don't possess them or own them or have any right to call them mine, but those are my grand jury rooms. I spent years in them. We have 8 grand juries in Washington, D.C., sitting at all times, because unfortunately we have more than our fair share of crime. And Jeanine Pirro, U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia, sent prosecutors in there to try to convince grand jurors to indict 8-year felony offenses against somebody who was so incensed at the militarization of the streets of Washington, D.C. We saw it as he threw a sandwich. He threw a sandwich. Sean Dunn is his name. He was a paralegal at the Department of Justice. He lived in D.C. He saw what was being done to his city. And you could see how angry he was. Actually there for a protest of immigration enforcement policies at the time. And okay, public service announcement. Don't throw sandwiches at police officers. Don't throw anything. And I say this as a career prosecutor. Don't throw anything at police officers. Don't put a hand on a police officer, because all of those acts constitute some version of assault and or battery. And I usually launch into a law school class about the nuances of assault and battery and what throwing a sandwich is. I'll spare you all that. So yes, it was a battery. It was an unconsented to touching. If I throw a sandwich and it comes in contact with someone's body, it's a crime. It's a misdemeanor. It's the lowest level crime imaginable. And as somebody who screened arrests forever in Washington, D.C., that would have been a no paper. In other words, we wouldn't have charged any crime for somebody throwing a sandwich and the sandwich actually bouncing off his bulletproof vest. I'm not making light of a battery. And Jeanine Pirro sent somebody into the grand jury to convince them that that was an 8-year federal felony crime. You ever hear the saying, don't make a federal case out of it? It's kind of the poster child. And that grand jury, this is again where the justice juices get flowing. That grand jury and so many grand juries after them as the conscience of the community. That was one of the people in the grand jury. It was us. They were lawyers. They got a notice from the judge. Come on down. You've been called for grand jury service. And they stood up to Jeanine Pirro. They said, no. No, and I know we've heard a grand jury will indict a ham sandwich. That's not true. That's not my lived experience, unless the ham sandwich committed a crime, and then you got to crack down on the ham sandwich. Grand juries generally do what prosecutors ask them to do, but you know what? That's because prosecutors only bring cases before the grand jury where we believe we have enough admissible evidence to indict and convict. That's my lived experience. And I served with 325 to 350 prosecutors at a time for 24 years. And there was lots of attrition. In my section, the homicide section, I had 30 federal homicide prosecutors that I supervised at a time. And there was lots of attrition. So I don't know how many I supervised over the years. And one thing that never happened is we never went into the grand jury and had the grand jury say, oh, go away. I'm going to indict this person. I have a recurring segment I do called The Prosecutor's Verdict with a fellow career prosecutor, now retired. He 35 years, me 30 years. In our 65 years, between us, we had one grand jury refused to indict. And you know what? It was in a case. It was a murder case. And it was so close on the evidence that we thought the right thing to do was present the evidence to the grand jury and let them, as the conscience of the community, decide if there was enough. And they felt it was his case, not mine. I'm not calling him out. He says this publicly because I never had one. I know. But, we got like 11 of the 12 votes necessary to indict, and that the conscience of the community had spoken. And it was the right thing to do, to present that case and live with the results and respect the grand jury's determination. But that's not what Jeanine Pirro's doing. And to prove the point, not only was it Sean Dunn, but it was Sidney Laurie Reed was another woman. If you may remember this, I bring these cases up because there's so much good news that we can mine from what the grand jurors are doing nationwide. Sidney Laurie Reed was outside the DC jail where there are protests all the time. There are people who are here maybe undocumented, and they are, when they're released from the DC jail, there are protesters out there, and they're there to support them, and they're giving them clothing and food and transportation and help, as we are doing, people are doing in cities all around the world, all over the country. And Sidney Laurie Reed was there, and an FBI agent and an immigration officer tried to take a particular person into custody for immigration reasons who had just been released from the DC jail. And Sidney Laurie Reed stepped between them. Whether that was a smart move or not, that's what she did. There was a little bit of pushing. There were no punches, there were no weapons, there were no injuries, but the FBI agent got a little scratch on the back of her hand as a result of this scuffle. You know, Bactine and a Band-Aid is what it was treated with virtually. And Janine Pirro sent somebody in, federal felony offense. And the grand jury said, no, 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 go away. And she presented some of these cases abusing prosecutorial discretion over and over and over and over again to grand juries, and each one said no. That's us. That is literally the people serving as a bulwark against executive branch overreach, abuse, misconduct, and outright unethical conduct. Let me put it that way. And all of these people are going to be referred to bar counsel because they each hold a license to practice law from their respective states. I'm licensed in New Jersey. Once you have one license to practice law from a state, you can practice anywhere federally as a federal prosecutor. And I mean, I don't know why these lawyers are doing this, because they just need to look back a few years ago and see what other Trump-affiliated lawyers have suffered. Rudy Giuliani disbarred twice. Jeffrey Clark, Jeffrey Clark, that dirty DOJ lawyer who tried to take over as attorney general and tried to, squirrel the election results down in Georgia, disbarred. John Eastman, the architect of the fake elector scheme, disbarred. Kenneth Chesbrough actually pleaded guilty to charges down in the RICO charges down in Georgia. Disbarred. I mean, this is what happens to lawyers who, like Pam Bondi, Todd Blanche, Janine Pirro, and others, are doing the dirty work of an aspiring day one dictator. I don't understand it. I don't know why they're subjecting themselves to the ultimate bar disciplinary investigation they've got coming their way, but they are. I think it's the proximity to power. People become intoxicated in some way. So, and then let's round out the abuse of the rule of law, particularly as it relates to the grand jury, with something that if a Hollywood scriptwriter came up with it, it would be laughed out of the director's or the producer's room. Janine Pirro sent somebody that she had hired specifically for this purpose, somebody who is a dance photographer, for real. That's what he does full time. He used to be a local prosecutor up in Westchester County and knew Janine Pirro from back in the day, hired him as special counsel to Janine, sent him into the grand jury to indict 6 members of Congress who had committed no crime. Can you imagine a more egregious abuse of the rule than sending somebody into the grand jury to indict people who had committed no crime? 6 members of the opposing party, nonetheless. 2 senators and 4 representatives. And all they did, take it from this old Army jag, is they virtually opened the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Those are the crimes, just kind of like the civilian federal code. And they read from it. They said military members must disobey unlawful orders. Can you imagine if the contrary were true? And you could be ordered to shoot and kill unarmed civilians, and you were obliged to follow that order and murder people because I'm just following orders. Lieutenant Calley tried that in New Lie. Didn't work so good for him. All they did was literally military law. They tried to indict them. And never, I would take a flyer that this has never happened in the history of any grand jury. 0 grand jurors voted to indict. 0. That's we the people holding strong against executive branch overreach, abuse, and corruption. That gives me a great level of confidence. And even when they do manage to get indictments, vindictive indictments, FBI Director James Comey, New York State Attorney General Letitia James, when Lindsay Halligan went in, having no lawful right to set foot in the grand jury, as judges have since ruled, and twisted arms in there and said things that were illegal and unconstitutional, we know because we saw the grand jury minutes. Those indictments were dismissed so fast, and they didn't even get to the vindictive prosecution. They didn't have to. Let me go back and finish the story, because when you can't get a felony indictment in the grand jury, you know what you can do? Do we have any lawyers in the room? I hope not. No, I'm not going to call anybody out and ask questions. This is not a Socratic method discussion. If you can get a felony indictment, there is the possibility of charging that person with a misdemeanor, a low-level crime, because misdemeanors don't require a grand jury indictment, only felonies. So the prosecutor can literally draft up a complaint, sign his or her name to it. Now that person is charged, albeit in a misdemeanor, so very low-level crime with low-level punishment. Shapiro couldn't twist the arms of grand jurors to indict the sandwich thrower or Sidney Laurie Reed, who ended up somehow with an FBI agent with a scratch on her hand. And again, I don't mean to belittle that. I worked with law enforcement for decades, and I respect and admire them. Shapiro charged them with misdemeanors. And what happened? They went into court, they tried the cases, and both juries in those 2 separate cases found them not guilty without even having time for a cup of coffee in the deliberation room. That's we the people doing that. That's us. The jurors are us, sitting as the conscience of the community, both grand jurors and trial jurors. And that, I believe, will continue to happen as they continue to try to bring vindictive prosecutions against, you name it, Jerome Powell or Adam Schiff or, but you know what? They're being defeated at every turn. Those are points of light. That's reason to be optimistic. See, I'm not even getting through half of, make sure, Peggy, if you need to get the hook or raise the music and play me off into the Q&A, let me know. Let me try to speed it up a little bit. See, I get really worked up when I start talking about this. They're attacking the Fourth Amendment and the Fifth Amendment. I don't know if anybody here has a favorite amendment, but I do. Maybe that makes me a law geek. The Fourth Amendment, the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated. Shall not, non-negotiable, and no warrant shall issue but upon probable cause. That's the second clause. But, I taught for 9 years at GW, 4 years to law school, 5 years undergrad. The first thing I would do first day is I'd walk in and put on the whiteboard. I would draw, I'm not an artist, I would draw a brick wall. And the bricks in that wall are the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. The Fourth Amendment is right in the middle, anchoring them all. And I would put the government on one side, prosecutors, police, FBI, the entire government, and the people on the other, us. And they don't get to breach that wall unless they do it right, like with a warrant signed by a judge. Then they can search and seize you. But that's not what ICE and CBP are doing. They are violating the constitutional rights of undocumented immigrants, documented immigrants, American citizens, visitors to our nation. They're violating their Fourth Amendment right against unreasonable seizures. Fancy word for, I'm grabbing you. I'm telling you to stop. I'm busting out your window. I'm pulling you out of your car. Those are seizures. They're also violating the Fifth Amendment due process rights by stuffing people on planes and sending them to a prison in El Salvador, even though the overwhelming majority of those people committed no crime. We're imprisoning them in El Salvador. And I'll tell you, if you're not inspired by Kilmar Abrego Garcia's battle against the government from a prison in El Salvador, mind you, he had a judge, I think in 2019, that he may not be deported to El Salvador because he had a credible fear of being returned there. They didn't care. Stuck him in a prison in El Salvador, though he had been convicted of crime. Gross violation of human rights there, never mind constitutional rights. And Abrego Garcia has been fighting the federal government ever since, and he has been winning and winning and winning and winning and winning. And if that doesn't inspire us to fight, if he can fight, we can fight peacefully. And we don't use peacefully as a punchline, as others have in the past. We use peacefully as a bedrock principle. And I always think of those 600 people who walked across that Edmund Pettus Bridge for voting rights peacefully, even at great risk to themselves. If they can do it, Abrego Garcia can do it, we can do it. Day after tomorrow, there will be contempt hearings against DOJ prosecutors and DHS officials in 28 cases set for March 3rd to see whether they should be held in both civil and criminal contempt. That's the one piece that's been missing from the federal judiciary, in my opinion, contempt. Because at some point you have to stop talking about how the federal prosecutors and DHS just keep violating our orders. You have to start holding them in contempt. These are not strong people. These are not brave people, and they're certainly not principled people. And if they find themselves in a jail cell, they're going to shape up. They're going to shape up. It's coming. March 3rd. Contempt doesn't come. The contempt hearings are coming for the first time. Judge Jeffrey Bryan in Minnesota, 28 cases. That's an important development. Let me try to, there's so many abuses in so little time. The Supreme Court finally did something right with the tariffs case. And you just see how long they waited to decide that. They just didn't want to alienate an aspiring dictator, but they finally did. I'm hopeful. I'm not going to say I'm optimistic, but I'm hopeful that is a sign of things to come, because when they started with the horrific presidential immunity ruling, and I do mean horrific, they decided, contrary to the express language of the Constitution, which says a president shall take care to faithfully execute the laws of the country. How does that translate into the president can violate all the laws of the nation, victimizing the American people in the process with complete immunity from prosecution? Don't those two things sound inconsistent? Right? And that is why I always quote, because he's way smarter than me, Yale law professor Akhil Reed-Amar, preeminent constitutional scholar, who said the Supreme Court in Trump versus United States, the presidential immunity case, ruled that the Constitution itself is unconstitutional. And he's right. So I didn't have high hopes, but the Supreme Court got the tariffs ruling right, and hopefully we're going to see more of that, because they recognize how lawless this man and his administration are and the damage they're doing. I know I've been going for 50 minutes and we want to get to a Q&A. So let me try to wrap it up. I hate not talking about these other abuses, but the points of light, the silver lining. We've talked about the grand jurors. We've talked about the trial jurors. We've talked about the example set by Abrego Garcia. I want to finish with circling back to the birthright citizenship case, because when the courts said, lower courts, trial court, court of appeals said, blatantly unconstitutional, you can't do it. It made its way up to the Supreme Court. What did they say? We don't have nationwide injunctions anymore. They sidestepped. That makes no sense, because if that executive order is unconstitutional as to one, child who was born in USA, it's unconstitutional as to all. It should be the subject of a nationwide injunction, but all of a sudden they didn't like nationwide injunctions. But what did the Supreme Court do? They left the crack open. They left the door open by saying, well, maybe we can accomplish the same thing with class actions. We're not judging anything. And what happened? 4 wonderful nonprofit organizations didn't just walk to court, they sprinted to court. And they convinced the judge to certify a class action lawsuit with the class of litigants who every infant born out after February 20th, 2025, the day that executive order was supposed to go into effect. And every infant born moving forward are members of a class. And it's another way to go about telling Donald Trump, no, you cannot amend the Constitution with a Sharpie. And those 4 organizations are the ACLU, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, the Asian Law Caucus, and the Democracy Defenders Fund, Norm Eisen's group. And the reason I end with them is because we're always talking about what can we do, and you all know the many, many, many ways we can get involved and engage, right? And a lot of people think about, well, contact your elected officials, give to a candidate of your choice. Of course, all of that is great, but do you realize there are dozens and dozens and dozens of nonprofit organizations like the 4 I just mentioned that go to court every day and fight for our rights? They fight for our rights, but we're the lawyers. I mean, they're not our lawyers. We don't pay them. We don't retain them. But they're fighting for our rights. They just protected a whole class of children. American soil. And, you know, when you talk about how can we engage, that's another way to engage. Not only giving, donating to them, but they need all kinds of help and services. And I heard somebody say, you know, I'm a retired accountant. I can go give accounting services to these organizations, or I can do a door knocking campaign. I can work the phones. I can whatever. And, you know, those are the people literally with boots on the ground in the courtrooms around the country fighting for us and our rights and our children and our grandchildren's rights. So, you know, that's a way that I think we can engage. And that I think is a huge point of light, because these lawyers, these law firms, these nonprofits are running circles around the DOJ lawyers that Pam Bondi's sending into court as sacrificial lambs. So I think we're going to make our way through this darkness. I think the rule of law will come back into the light of day eventually, and then it will be our job to go on the accountability mission. You know, and whether we're going to call it the American Accountability Project, the AAP, or a wonderful Team Justice member on Substack came up with, the Accountability and Reconciliation Commission, right? The ARC, the arc of the moral universe, which is long, but it bends toward justice. That is one of my favorite sayings. And the second is Abraham Lincoln's, be sure to plant your feet in the right place, then stand firm. And that's what we're doing. And that's what we're going to continue to do. And I think we're going to survive this dark chapter in American history. And then accountability. We have time for Q&A, or did I talk too long?
Glenn, thank you so much for your wonderful comments. And like you're saying, we all need to do something, whatever that something is.
Those of you who were here a few weeks ago, we had our discussion, the kind of from within the social justice ran. We talked about what is it that we as individuals and as our community, our unity community, what is it that we can do? Because the one thing we cannot do is to sit there and go, I'm afraid I can't do anything. That's exactly what Bowie wants us to do. So whatever we can do, whether it's donating money, as Glenn said, if you've got an accounting background or whatever your background is, volunteer your services to organizations. If you're still protesting like I am after 50 plus years, get back in the streets. Whatever it is you can do. We've got somebody sitting right here who was trained in nonviolence back in the 60s. And Joanne was out there with the sit-ins and all that stuff. She was at the first march on Washington. Her daughter, Kim, is an attorney, and she's here. So we have people right here in our community who we can look at and go, okay, what did you do back then? How did you get through this? Because what we're facing now is serious. And as Glenn said, we've got the courts supporting us so far. And even some of Trump's own appointed judges are ruling against him, thank heavens. Not all of them, but some of them are. So what is it that we can do? So we got time for some questions and answers. We've got some mics, and please, when you ask a question, make sure you have the mic because we are on Zoom and we're being recorded. So without the mic, people can't hear you. When you get the mic, hold it like an ice cream cone. And Gladys, Patty's got her hand up right here.
And I just have to say, I loved hearing the points of light. Thank you. I needed that.
All that was done to the, January 6th folks, and they were pardoned. What happens to all that work that happened? If the arc comes back around, is there anything that can be done to get justice for people that tried to overthrow the government?
I wish I had a better answer than there's probably little that can be done to undo presidential pardons. I think, pardons are kind of a relic from the royal days, and I'm not a fan of pardons, as you can imagine, as a career prosecutor, because it wipes away the work that I did, my team did for sometimes years. So I don't think they can be undone. I do think there are a number of the J6 defendants who are literally back in prison right now because they've committed new crimes. And think about that. This is the president pardoning people who are going out and victimizing other folk in the community. I think one of the things we have to do is make sure that the people who Pam Bondi has hired, who were insurrectionists, and they're now working at the Department of Justice, they need to be challenged for cause. We don't unlawfully terminate or summarily terminate anybody, but there's a process you go through. And some of the folks who were convicted of J6 crimes have no business being in our Department of Justice representing the interests of the American people, which is what they're supposed to be doing when they're really representing the interests of the president. So there are things that can be done, but I'm going to say it's like incremental, and it's not. I wish we could revoke corruptly delivered pardons, but I don't see a legal way to get there unless precedent is never set in stone, right? And the Supreme Court has said presidential immunity and pardons are one of the core constitutional functions where the president can't be questioned or investigated. He could literally buy the silence of a co-conspirator by giving that person a pardon, which is insane from a societal perspective, never mind the rule of law. But precedent is never set in stone. If it was, we would still be living with Dred Scott's horrific precedent, Plessy versus Ferguson's horrific precedent, Paul Matsu's horrific precedent. It took time, but we made sure we kept bending the arc toward justice, and we got cases that overturned those horrific precedents. What we have to do is find a case that we can get up to the Supreme Court in the future to overturn Trump versus United States presidential immunity and to deal with the pardon issue. That's a long-term fix, but it's one we have to pursue. Nobody said this was going to be easy, but I don't think anything is more important.
Yeah, hi. What do you think about Trump being president for a third term? Because I believe the Constitution says something about you cannot run for president for a third term. And there's they're talking about loophole where Vance went for president and then he resigns and then Trump becomes president. So what do you think of that possibility?
Yeah, I mean, we should we should have a book written called Presidential Powers for Dummies, or the Constitution for Dummies, right? Because, he is forever trying to get us all upset and angry and distracted from things like the Epstein files. He might even launch a war to accomplish that. listen, the text of the Constitution is what it is, right? You can't run for office twice. You can't be elected to president. So they're coming up with the scheme. Well, maybe, we could get him appointed as Speaker of the House, and then we can get rid of the president and the vice president, and then he'll become my inclination is to say none of that would pass judicial challenge. But I always qualify anything I say about what I think the courts might do with the Supreme Court. And if we don't reform the Supreme Court, everybody in the federal government has a mandatory code of ethics that we have to follow, except 9 government employees, the Supreme Court. That's governmental insanity. So put it this way, I'm concerned about a whole lot. I'm not so concerned with him successfully being installed for a 3rd term somehow. I don't think that'll happen. And let's face it, his health and his mental faculties are failing. So I don't even know that he finishes out this term for any number of reasons. But if we can hasten that along with impeachment after the midterms, that would be wonderful. Sure.
Hi there. Thank you so much for being here today. I wish I could be in 2 places at once because I'd love to be there. But I have 3 questions. One is, to the point on the Supreme Court, how likely are we to see it expanded? The second is, can you speak to why on earth Merrick Garland slow-walked naming Jack Smith, and whether Jack Smith will be safe from pernicious persecution? I know that there are people like my dear Joanne who fought on the front lines, but there are people, a lot of us who have been active and voted and, been involved. And this is pretty scary because when you see them going after that congresswoman in New Jersey for just doing her job, you realize that one of the things that they're out to do is ruin people. And there doesn't seem to be any protection for that, even while he is destroying parts of the White House, maligning, messing up the Kennedy Center. How do we recover?
So, first of all, with respect to the odds that the Supreme Court will be expanded, all I can say is I think the odds are greater now than they have been previously. President Biden did not have an appetite to work on expanding the number of Supreme Court justices. I wish he had, because when you think about over time, the expansion of our population, and first of all, 9 is not a magic number. 9, we've had as few as 5 Supreme Court justices in our nation's history. We've had as many as 10. 9 is not a magic number. And with the increased population, the caseloads in the federal courts have exploded. So what have we done? We've increased federal trial court judges, the numbers. We've increased the judges on the courts of appeals. It only makes sense that we increase the Supreme Court justices for any number of reasons, including there are supervisory responsibilities that each justice has over one of the federal jurisdictions, but there are now 13 federal jurisdictions. We got to have at least 13 Supreme Court justices. Right? It makes sense for so many reasons. Primarily, it makes sense because we have some compromised justices on the Supreme Court. We have justices who violated federal law by ignoring their responsibilities to make financial disclosures. I had to fill out those forms every year, and they were the bane of my existence. But I'll tell you, I was going to make sure I didn't put a decimal in the wrong place on any of those forms, so I could be accused of not fully disclosing everything and anything that I was legally required to disclose. And they violated those laws. There should be impeachment inquiries for those justices, and the Department of Justice should launch investigations because there's adequate predication, fancy term for enough evidence, to open that kind of a probe to see whether they should be held accountable. We've abdicated our responsibility to hold what I call the ruling class criminals accountable for what they've done. We hold them accountable just like average you know, ordinary human beings like us. We are mere mortals. Some of them view themselves as something else. So I think that's not a great answer, but I think there is a greater chance moving forward that we're finally learning our lesson. Those lessons are, is we need to add justices to the Supreme Court. In my opinion, why did Merrick Garland wait so long was your second question. He dropped the ball. He dropped the ball. He believed that he could somehow restore the legitimacy and the public's perception of the legitimacy of the Department of Justice if he declined to go after high-powered politicians who committed crimes. I think that's the opposite of what we should have been doing to enhance the legitimacy and the perceived legitimacy of the Department of Justice. I will say I sat across desks, conference room tables, and kitchen tables, lots of kitchen tables from victims. And what I never told a single victim was the way we're going to put your personal nightmare behind you, just like we've tried to put long national nightmares behind us, is I'm going to decline to prosecute the person who attacked you. So go ahead and heal. But that was Merrick Garland's approach, the way I see it. And it backfired badly. And that's part of the reason we are where we are, because Donald Trump should be in prison for the classified documents case right now.
Right now.
He committed those crimes in Florida after he left office, so he doesn't even have a presidential immunity argument. But what he did have was a biased and corrupt judge in his pocket, in my opinion. So I hope that answered. I don't know if there was a third question, but I think that I try to answer two.
You got him. I guess the third is, what's it going to take to get Congress to step up? Is there something that he has on all of these, the Republicans that prevents them from growing a spine and addressing the part of the Constitution that says that there are three co-equal branches to the government?
That's what it's going to take, in my opinion. And it's actually a great question. Does he have something on them? Because nothing else explains to my satisfaction how they can lay down, give up their co-equal branch of government status and let him walk all over them. I don't understand that. Like, will not make some sense there, but I can't say he has anything over them. What he does have is he knows that there are weak individuals who want power more than they want a healthy democracy. And that's why we've had the Liz Cheneys and the Adam Kinzingers of the world say my re-election doesn't matter. What matters is the health of American democracy. And they were willing to fight for it. But to answer your question, what might it take? Maybe it will take unconstitutionally declaring war. And didn't he just do that yesterday? Maybe Republican members of Congress will say that's a bridge too far, because we've already lost American service members, and how many innocent Indians have been killed, including a schoolhouse full of girls. Maybe that will begin to move some of the Republicans in Congress.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So do you think Central America bill pass requiring IDs to vote? And if it did pass, what do you think would happen if it went back to the Supreme Court?
I hope it doesn't pass, but I never underestimate the cowardice of the Republicans in Congress. If it does pass, it will instantly be challenged, and I think it will successfully be challenged. That's the best I've got. So again, that is definitely a concern, but it's a kind of down on the list of concerns that I have at this moment. But let's first see. Again, I think him declaring war unconstitutionally, where's the word he used, and we're now losing American service members, is going to have more people, even in the Republican Party and perhaps even in Congress, finally pulling away from him and saying, enough, enough. Dead military members, enough. Yeah.
Hi, thanks so much for being here. One of the things that I found incredibly frustrating, I'm not sure if you're the right person to ask this, but is watching rulings come down on what I would consider to be the side of justice, but then no enforcement happen. What can we do about that, if anything? And what is your thinking on that?
That's where contempt has to come in. And what I know is judges are extraordinarily reluctant to hold government officials in contempt. But now we have seen this rising chorus of federal judicial voices saying, we're done. And a couple of them in recent days literally said, and I quote, "It stops now." And that's not the judge who just ordered 28 contempt hearings on March 3rd. They're finally there, I believe. So now when these folks are going to run the risk of having their butts sitting in a jail cell until they purge the contempt, until they comply with court orders, they're not going to be so big and brave and strong. And that will send an important message of deterrence. Stop it. So we're there now, and let's see what happens in the next couple of weeks.
Thank you.
Got one in the back. Almost. Now I can. Sorry, everybody.
I learned to project when I was in theater. Anyway, thank you very much for your presentation. There are a few things I wanted to mention. I have had a couple of careers. One of them was as a professional stand-up comedian. So thank you for what you said. Secondly, I have been studying the Constitution and the laws of this land and the constitutions of the other nations in the world, and I am wonderfully surprised by the similarities of so many of the constitutions of the world to the United States Constitution. Recently, I went down to Washington, D.C. to go see the Charters of Freedom in person again, and it brought tears to my eyes. There are three things that I may have missed that you discussed. One of them was the drug boats. Another one was the invasion of Venezuela.
Yeah.
And those, to me, I remember back when the United States invaded Panama to bring the gentleman from Panama to, I don't remember the name of the operation.
Noriega.
Yeah, Manuel Noriega, thank you. And I was reminded of that a little bit. But those two particular things, and there's one other thing, but I would like to hear your response to that.
It was on card number 6 that I didn't get to. I appreciate you asking that.
Yeah.
So first of all, I rely on one of the preeminent voices on military law, international law, and the law of war, a wonderful gentleman named Dan Maurer, and I have him on about once a week. He's going to be on with me tomorrow evening at 5:30 on Substack. He taught constitutional law and criminal law at West Point. He taught at the Army's JAG School on the campus of UVA. He's an Army JAG retired lieutenant colonel. He's a true expert. He has laid out many times for me, because it was an education for me, how the murderous strikes on Venezuelan drug boats are absolutely and inarguably illegal, whether you analyze them under domestic law, military law, international law, or the law of war. They're all different things. Absolutely illegal. And hopefully people will be held accountable for them at some point in the future. Our invasion into Venezuela was, in his opinion, absolutely unlawful. And they played game, well, it's a civilian law enforcement operation to extract the president who's been indicted. And so they grabbed the president, Maduro, they grabbed his wife. What did they do? They left the entire corrupt regime in place. So this was not about regime change, which we can talk about the pros and cons of regime change. We don't ordinarily do so good as a nation when we try to change other countries' leadership. But let me quickly add that the people of Iran have been struggling mightily since 1979 under horrifically corrupt and abusive leadership. So there are mixed feelings about whether, regime change might be necessary. But again, I'm not a fan of regime change. That's not really what we as a country and as a military are supposed to be doing. But what did he do? He started taking their oil, taking oil tankers, getting together with oil executives in the White House, some of whom said, yeah, Mr. President, we don't want that oil, thanks anyway. And so all of that is kind of unraveling. You know what that was about. And do you really think he just launched an attack on Iran because he wants to liberate people? You know, there are three words that came to mind last night. Obliterate, liberate, and I'll tell you the third one in a second. Well, he told us a few months ago that he obliterated their nuclear program. So why are you going to obliterate their nuclear program again? Might you have been lying? Liberate. Are you really? So you're going to liberate the people. First of all, they don't have weapons. They can't rise up. I mean, they can, but it's very difficult. And just killing the leadership is not liberating the people. But now, once you've liberated them, I assume you're going to let them use all of their own oil and natural resources to rebuild their country and, you know, do well for everybody. No, that's the third word. It ain't obliterate and it ain't liberate. It's lubricate by using their oil. And they're going to take their oil.
One other thing that I wanted to mention is one of the things that you've said during the course of this talk, which I very much appreciate, is framing things in terms of peace, which I think is essential. And when I read I'm a very big supporter of the news networks and what they do to help inform and educate the people. However, early on, I was sort of reared in comedy on George Carlin, and he talked a lot about language and framing things using language in a really brilliant way. And one of the things that I've seen in the Washington Post and other newspapers and news organization is a consistent framing of things in terms of war metaphors, battle metaphors. It's always a battle. It's always an us versus them. It's always it's not a we the people. And that affects the way that things are processed and meaning making that occurs in the reader and the audience. I was wondering if you could comment on that. What do you think?
It's one of the reasons I finally left corporate media, because there are no two sides to treason, first of all. And we are forever. I mean, every time I see corporate news giving Donald Trump uninterrupted airtime for like an hour at a pop, you're just letting him spew propaganda into the public square and poison us all. So yeah, framing is all important. The Washington Post has lost its way. But I agree with you, and I'm a huge George Carlin fan too. And you know, framing can be everything, how you communicate things. And that's why I have to tell you, I even hesitate to use the word fight because it connotes a certain thing, but I can't shy away from it because we are in the fight of our lives for the rule of law, the constitutional rights of everyone in our very democracy. But I always make sure to add peacefully, not a punchline, but we are in a fight. But yeah, framing is everything. And I don't think corporate media has been up to the challenge, unfortunately.
Do you think that President Trump will be held accountable in a world court for his international atrocities?
Do I think he'll be held accountable in signatories? We're not part of the International Criminal Court, so I think there's a jurisdictional impediment there. I do think here, and this is another point of light, and it's such a good one that I forgot. You know, we know that the two federal criminal cases that were up and running against Donald Trump, not to mention the state case, which is now derailed down in Georgia, the two federal cases, classified documents case, which was shooting fish in a barrel. I mean, that he's so guilty on that, on the evidence. And the January 6th case, where he was still facing 4 felony counts when he got reelected. So what happened in those two cases? The process, it's the royal we, I'm not a prosecutor anymore. The Department of Justice was in the process of appealing the wrongful dismissal by Aileen Cannon of the classified documents case. And then it got short-circuited because he got reelected. And Jack Smith felt compelled to move to dismiss it without prejudice. But those words without prejudice are so important because that means it can be rebrought in the future. So it's not done. It's not dead. That's not a guarantee that it will be rebrought, but legally it can be. And there are ways around the statute of limitations problem. Let's go to the January 6th case. Do you know where we were when he got reelected? In court, in front of a jurist that I have such respect for, Tanya Chutkin, who was presiding over the prosecution of Donald Trump for his January 6 crimes. I used to try murder cases against Tanya Chutkin when she was a public defender and I was a homicide prosecutor. We have a great relationship. And she was litigating, those 4 felony charges survived the Supreme Court's presidential immunity ruling, and I believe, I have no inside information, I believe she would have ruled, of course they survive. Of course we can go to trial, because those are not constitutional functions of a president. They're official presidential acts. Those are the 2 categories that enjoy either absolute or presumptive immunity. So she would have said, let's go to trial. That's where we were. And that's where we need to get back to once he falls from power. Doesn't mean it's necessarily going to produce a guilty verdict, but the result, once you turn it over to the capable hands of 12 citizens sitting in a wooden box as the conscience of the community, we live with the result. Lose or draw being a hung jury. And I predict that if we can get either of those 2 cases into the hands of jurors once he falls from power, he's going to be convicted in a DC minute, just like he was convicted in a New York minute of 34 felonies when a jury got to decide. It ain't over. It ain't over by a long shot.
We've got time for about 2 more questions, anybody?
I'm so grateful to have this opportunity. How do you find impartial jurors in New York City?
Find impartial jurors to sit the same way we found them in New York. Because if he was a known commodity anywhere, he was a known commodity in New York. And they found 12 plus a number of alternates, jurors who could sit fairly, impartially, and independently and decide the case based only on the evidence introduced at trial and nothing else. And they got that evidence and they convicted him like that. We can find, I seated more juries than most. We can find fair, independent, impartial jurors in Washington, D.C. It's actually not that hard to do. That's why we have the voir dire process, speak the truth, jury selection, where we get to ask them the questions, they get to answer them, and then we decide whether it is an appropriate juror or not, somebody who can sit fairly and impartially. That's not the hard part. Yes.
He's already been shown to have enriched himself by about $4 billion since he's been in office. Now we've got this board piece, the Venezuela money, the Iran money. How do we know that he's putting in his own pocket?
I mean, that he has to be, so remember the presidential immunity case has nothing to do with civil suits that can be brought. And we need to go just as aggressively bringing civil suits as we're going to need to go bringing criminal charges. I just feel like we really need to have learned the lessons of the past, both Watergate in 74 and in 2020 when we failed to hold them accountable. We have to learn those lessons and we have to go as hard as the law allows us to go without hesitation, without fear or favor. I have some hope that we will. I know there are a lot of us champing at the bit to get back into government, to go on that accountability mission. But what I also say is if we fail a third time to hold the rich, powerful, influential, connected criminals accountable, I don't think we get to keep our republic, and I don't think we will keep our republic if we fail a third time, but we're determined not to fail a third time.
Yeah, this is sort of a follow-up to the question Alban in the back asked. You said you were encouraged by the recent Supreme Court ruling, as many of us are. So what do they do next? Because he turned around and said, oh, well, I'm just going to impose 10%, then 15%.
Yeah.
What is their next step? That's my first question. My second question is, I always love to hear you talk about the points of light. I think they're amazing. Is there one thing, if you're willing to share it, that keeps you up at night, though? If you're willing to share it.
Okay, with respect to the tariffs, so there is a section of the something tariff act, I'm forgetting the name, and this is not my area of expertise as a career prosecutor, but it's section 122. And when I read up on it and talked to some folks who are more conversant in it, you know, there are temporary tariffs that a president can put in effect if there is a significant trade imbalance, or if there are literally bills that are owed to the United States that have gone unfulfilled for a certain period of time. So there are some statutory bases that he has to touch before he gets there. But under the right circumstances, he can put 10 or up to 15% tariffs in place for 150 days. And then he can't extend them beyond that unless he gets congressional buy-in. So my understanding from the experts is what he did in knee-jerk fashion by saying 10%, no 15% for a temporary period of time, that doesn't necessarily violate the law the way his harebrained tariffs did. So I'm not that concerned with that at this moment. What keeps me up at night is that my children, my grandchildren are not going to have the free, fair democracy that I grew up in, that we grew up in. And that is what keeps me doing what I do 7 days a week, which is just a little piece of translating legalese into English and trying to talk about what's really going on. And but that's what keeps me up. Listen, this is not what I had on my bingo card when I retired from DOJ. I thought I was going to be off playing with my grandkids, and but we are all called to kind of meet this moment, and I think that's what you all are doing too, engaging in every way you can engage. So that's what keeps me up at night.
Glenn, thank you so much for being here. Would you remind everybody where they find you and how they find you?
Yeah, so the two places are on YouTube, Justice Matters with Glenn Kirschner, and it's free to subscribe. So just hit subscribe if you wouldn't mind. I'm a bad YouTuber. I never ask people hit subscribe, but that's what you're supposed to say. And then on Substack every night at 8:30 p.m. Eastern time, we do a community meeting, also completely free. And it's a great place to just talk about the legal issue of the day, talk about ways to engage and vent a little bit. We kind of call it our therapy session. So I'm on there almost 7 nights a week at 8:30 p.m. And then I'm on Substack during the day interviewing various experts. So come on over to Substack and join our community meetings if you're interested.
Thank you so much, because if you're not familiar with Substack, it's a place to go to find unedited news. And a whole lot of people who, as Glenn said, were formerly on commercial news channels are now on Substack because they're not being restricted of what they can say. So thank you all for being here today, for your great questions, and thank you all on Zoom for being here as well. And as you've heard again today, we've all got something we can do. Whatever is ours to do, 5calls.org is an easy way to make phone calls every day. Just pull it up. It gives you a script as to what to say. You're supposed to call your own members of Congress. And of course, all of ours are thinking the same way we do. You can also do like I've been doing, calling at night after they close and calling people who are not my representatives, because it's like, they're not going to listen to me if I'm not their constituent. But I've been calling and leaving messages on their phones too. So because those are the people who need to hear what we're saying a lot too. And I didn't say that, but yes, I did. So
I'm going to steal that. I love that.
So as a retired federal employee, as a retired federal diversity manager, I would have been fired on January 20th last year. We've all got a lot to do. And I know that we're going to do it. And I know it's going to take all of us doing something. So thank you all for being here today. Keep it up. We'll be continuing to have these conversations. And beginning on March 12th, we're going to be doing 3 sessions with the National Constitution Center They're going to be Thursday mornings from 10:30 to noon, both in person and online. The Zoom link will be on the website as soon as I get it from the National Constitution Center. And we've got the titles for each one of those hot topics coming up. So plan to be part of that. Yeah, Patty? Yes, today is recorded, so you can go back and listen to it again. I'm sorry?
We can send it to our friends.
You can, yes, record, you can listen to the recording, and Amy, can they send it to people? Like, okay, so Amy's response was, you'll have to put it someplace so that it can be copied and, recorded to friends and family who need to hear this. So Glenn, thank you again so much.
Thank you for the invite.
Yeah.